They told me my concerns weren't worth their time, that I was being dramatic and wasting everyone's energy with my petty complaints. What they didn't realize was that dismissing me would become the most expensive mistake Hartwell Industries had ever made. My name is Elena Vasquez, and this is the story of how I turned their casual cruelty into a problem so massive that it nearly destroyed everything they'd built. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The fluorescent lights in the Hartwell Industries break room buzzed with that familiar electrical hum that had become the soundtrack to my workdays. I sat at the corner table, the same spot I'd claimed every lunch break for the past 8 years, staring at the email on my phone screen that had just shattered what little faith I had left in this company. The subject line read "Final Warning Attendance Policy Violation," and the sender was Miranda Cross, our new Human Resources Director who had been making my life miserable for the past 6 months. I read the email 3 times, my hands trembling slightly as the words sank in. According to Miranda, my request to leave early the previous Friday to attend my grandmother's funeral constituted an unexcused absence because I had failed to provide adequate documentation of the death. The documentation I had provided, a copy of the obituary and funeral program, was apparently insufficient because it didn't include a certified death certificate. The email went on to state that this was my final warning, and any future attendance issues would result in immediate termination. My grandmother Esperanza Vasquez had raised me after my parents died in a car accident when I was 12. She was the only family I had left, and her funeral had been the most important day of my life in years. The fact that they were treating it like some frivolous excuse to skip work made my stomach turn with a mixture of grief and rage. I had been working at Hartwell Industries since I was 22, straight out of college with a degree in environmental science. What started as an entry-level position in their compliance department had gradually evolved into something much more significant, though my job title and pay had never reflected the true scope of my responsibilities. I was officially listed as a junior environmental compliance specialist, but in reality, I had become the person who kept Hartwell's manufacturing operations from violating dozens of federal environmental regulations. The company manufactured industrial chemicals, the kind that required strict monitoring and reporting to agencies like the EPA and OSHA. Over the years, I had developed comprehensive systems for tracking emissions, managing waste disposal, and ensuring that all of our processes stayed within legal limits. I had caught numerous potential violations before they became problems, saved the company hundreds of thousands of dollars in fines, and maintained our spotless environmental record. Yet somehow I was still treated like an expendable employee who could be replaced at any moment. The culture at Hartwell had always been challenging, but it had gotten significantly worse since the company was acquired by Meridian Capital Group 18 months ago. The new ownership had brought in a management team that seemed to view employees as nothing more than line items on a budget sheet. Miranda Cross was perhaps the worst of them, a woman in her 40s who had gained her HR credentials at companies known for treating workers like disposable resources. From the moment Miranda arrived, she had made it clear that she viewed me as a problem employee. It started with small things, criticizing my choice to eat lunch alone rather than socializing with colleagues, questioning why I needed to leave at exactly 5 p.m. instead of staying late like some of the other employees. She seemed to interpret my professionalism and focus on my work as antisocial behavior that needed to be corrected. The real conflict began 3 months ago when I discovered what I believed to be a serious safety violation in our Building C manufacturing facility. During one of my routine inspections, I noticed that the ventilation system in the chemical mixing area was not functioning properly. The air quality readings I took showed elevated levels of volatile organic compounds that exceeded the safe exposure limits established by OSHA. This wasn't just a regulatory issue, it was a direct threat to the health and safety of the 12 employees who worked in that area every day. I immediately documented my findings and submitted a detailed report to my supervisor, David Chen, who had been with the company for 15 years and generally supported my work. David took the report seriously and agreed that we needed to address the ventilation problem immediately. However, when he brought it to the attention of upper management, the response was not what either of us expected. Instead of approving the funds to repair the ventilation system, which would have cost approximately $50,000, the executive team decided that my inspection had been overly cautious and that the readings I had taken were within acceptable variance of the legal limits. Miranda Cross called me into her office to discuss what she termed my tendency to create problems where none exist. The meeting with Miranda was one of the most frustrating professional experiences of my life. She sat behind her oversized desk, her perfectly manicured nails tapping against a folder that I assumed contained my personnel file, and proceeded to lecture me about the importance of being a team player rather than someone who rocks the boat with unnecessary concerns. She told me that Hartwell Industries had been operating successfully for over 30 years without any major environmental incidents, and that my alarmist approach to compliance was causing unnecessary stress and expense for the company. When I tried to explain the specific health risks associated with prolonged exposure to the chemicals we were manufacturing, she cut me off with a wave of her hand. "Elena," she said, her voice dripping with condescension, "I understand that you take your job seriously, but you need to understand that we don't have time for your problems. The company is under pressure to reduce costs and increase efficiency. We can't afford to chase after every theoretical risk that might or might not materialize into an actual issue." I tried to explain that worker safety wasn't a theoretical risk, that people were being exposed to dangerous chemicals every day they worked in Building C. I pulled out my documentation, the air quality readings, the OSHA guidelines that clearly stated the maximum safe exposure levels. Miranda barely glanced at the papers before pushing them back across the desk toward me. "The legal department has reviewed your report," she said, "and they've determined that we are in full compliance with all applicable regulations. Your interpretation of the data is simply incorrect." I knew that wasn't true. I had been doing this job for 8 years, and I understood environmental regulations better than anyone else at the company. The legal department consisted of 2 corporate lawyers who specialized in contract disputes and intellectual property issues, neither of whom had any expertise in environmental law. But Miranda wasn't interested in my expertise or my concerns. The meeting ended with her telling me that I needed to adjust my attitude and focus on being solution-oriented rather than problem-focused. She made it clear that my job security depended on my ability to stop raising what she considered to be unnecessary concerns about compliance issues. Over the following weeks, I tried a different approach. Instead of going through official channels, I attempted to address the ventilation problem directly with the Building C supervisor, Marcus Rodriguez. Marcus was a good man who genuinely cared about his workers, and when I explained the situation to him privately, he was deeply concerned. He told me that several of his employees had been complaining about headaches, dizziness, and respiratory irritation, symptoms that were consistent with exposure to the chemicals I had detected. Marcus and I worked together to document these health complaints and correlate them with the air quality data I had collected. We built a compelling case that the ventilation system needed immediate attention, not just for regulatory compliance, but for the basic health and safety of the workers. When Marcus brought this information to his own supervisor, however, the response was swift and punitive. Both Marcus and I were called into a meeting with Miranda Cross and the facility manager, James Morrison. Morrison was a company veteran who had worked his way up from the factory floor, but who had apparently fully embraced the new cost-cutting culture that Meridian Capital had implemented. He made it clear that our unauthorized investigation into the ventilation system was inappropriate, and that we had overstepped our authority by discussing safety concerns with the workers. Miranda took the lead in that meeting, her voice cold and professional as she explained that our actions had created unnecessary panic among the Building C employees and had undermined management authority by suggesting that the company was not adequately protecting worker safety. She informed us that any further insubordination would result in immediate disciplinary action. The most infuriating part of the meeting was when Morrison suggested that the health complaints Marcus had documented were likely psychosomatic, caused by our irresponsible discussion of potential safety risks rather than any actual exposure to harmful chemicals. He actually said that the workers were probably experiencing symptoms because we had planted the idea in their heads that they should be worried about the air quality. I sat in that meeting, listening to these people dismiss legitimate health concerns as psychological manipulation, and felt something inside me begin to change. I had always prided myself on being professional, on working within the system to solve problems and protect people. But the system was broken, and the people in charge were more interested in protecting their profits than protecting their workers. After that meeting, I made a decision that would change everything.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
If they weren't going to listen to my concerns through official channels, I would have to find another way to make them pay attention. I began documenting everything with a level of detail and precision that went far beyond what my job required. Every air quality reading, every maintenance report, every worker complaint, every meeting, every email, I created a comprehensive record of the company's environmental practices and the management's response to safety concerns. I also began researching federal whistleblower protection laws and environmental enforcement procedures. I learned about the various agencies that had jurisdiction over companies like Hartwell, and the specific processes for reporting violations when internal compliance systems failed. I discovered that the penalties for environmental violations had increased significantly in recent years, and that companies could face fines in the millions of dollars for serious infractions. What I found most interesting was that many environmental regulations included personal liability provisions for corporate officers who were aware of violations but failed to take corrective action. In some cases, executives could face criminal charges if their negligence resulted in environmental damage or worker injuries. I began to wonder if Miranda Cross and James Morrison fully understood the legal risks they were taking by ignoring my reports. The situation came to a head the week after my grandmother's funeral. I had been back at work for just 3 days when I received the final warning email about my attendance. The cruel irony of being disciplined for attending the funeral of the woman who raised me, while the company ignored serious safety violations that could harm dozens of workers, was not lost on me. That afternoon, I was conducting my weekly inspection of Building C when I discovered something that changed everything. The ventilation system hadn't just been malfunctioning, it had been deliberately disabled. Someone had removed a critical component from the air filtration unit and stored it in a maintenance closet. The serial number on the component matched the ventilation system, and the removal had clearly been intentional rather than the result of equipment failure. I stood in that maintenance closet, holding the missing component in my hands, and realized that the company hadn't just ignored my safety concerns, they had actively created the dangerous conditions I had been trying to fix. Someone had decided that it was cheaper to disable the ventilation system and risk worker exposure than to pay for proper maintenance and operation. The discovery of the disabled ventilation system was the final piece of evidence I needed. I had documented months of ignored safety concerns, retaliation against employees who raised health issues, and now proof that the company had deliberately created dangerous working conditions. I had enough evidence to destroy Hartwell Industries, and I was no longer interested in working within their broken system. That evening, I sat in my small apartment, surrounded by months of documentation, and began making phone calls. My first call was to the Environmental Protection Agency's Office of Inspector General, which investigates environmental crimes and violations. My second call was to the Occupational Safety and Health Administration's Whistleblower Protection Program. My third call was to a law firm that specialized in environmental litigation and had a track record of winning major cases against corporate polluters. What Miranda Cross and her colleagues didn't understand was that their dismissal of my concerns had given me the motivation and the time to build an airtight case against them. Every time they told me I was being dramatic, every time they said they didn't have time for my problems, they were giving me more evidence of their willful negligence and their deliberate indifference to worker safety. By the time I went to bed that night, I had set in motion a series of investigations that would ultimately cost Hartwell Industries more than $20 million in fines, legal fees, and remediation costs. Miranda Cross had told me that they didn't have time for my problems, but she was about to discover that they would need to make time for problems much bigger than anything I had ever brought to their attention. The irony was perfect. In trying to silence me, they had created the very conditions that made their destruction inevitable. They had dismissed my concerns about a $50,000 ventilation repair, and their negligence was about to cost them everything they had built. Sometimes the smallest problems, when ignored long enough, become the largest disasters. I fell asleep that night with a sense of peace I hadn't felt in months. Tomorrow, Miranda Cross and her colleagues would begin to understand what it really meant to have problems they couldn't ignore. The first call came at 6:47 in the morning, 3 weeks after I had submitted my formal complaints to the federal agencies. I was drinking coffee in my kitchen when my phone rang, displaying a number I didn't recognize. The voice on the other end was crisp and professional, belonging to Special Agent Rebecca Martinez from the EPA's Criminal Investigation Division. Miss Vasquez, I'm calling regarding the complaint you filed with our office about Hartwell Industries. We've completed our preliminary review of your documentation, and I need to schedule a meeting with you as soon as possible. This is now a formal federal investigation. The words sent a jolt of electricity through my body. I had hoped that my complaints would be taken seriously, but hearing that the EPA had opened a criminal investigation was more than I had dared to expect. Agent Martinez explained that my documentation was some of the most comprehensive evidence of environmental violations she had seen in her 15-year career, and that the deliberate disabling of the ventilation system constituted willful endangerment of workers. We'll need you to provide additional testimony and potentially testify before a federal grand jury, she continued. I want you to understand that this is a serious matter. The violations you've documented could result in criminal charges against multiple corporate officers, and the company is facing potential fines that could exceed $20 million. After I hung up, I sat in my kitchen trying to process what was happening. 3 weeks ago, I had been a dismissed employee whose concerns were considered unworthy of management's time. Now I was the key witness in a federal criminal investigation that could destroy the company that had treated me so poorly. The second call came later that morning, this time from OSHA. Inspector David Kim informed me that they had conducted a surprise inspection of the Hartwell facilities based on my complaint, and that they had confirmed every violation I had documented. The Building C ventilation system was indeed disabled, the air quality readings I had taken were accurate, and the worker health complaints Marcus Rodriguez had documented were consistent with chemical exposure. We've issued immediate citations requiring the company to cease operations in Building C until the ventilation system is properly repaired and all safety protocols are implemented. Inspector Kim explained. The fines for the violations we've identified total approximately $2.8 million, but that's just the beginning. If the EPA's investigation results in criminal charges, the penalties could be much more severe. I spent the rest of that day in a state of surreal disbelief. The problems that Miranda Cross had dismissed as unworthy of their time were now causing the company to face regulatory scrutiny from multiple federal agencies. The $50,000 ventilation repair they had refused to authorize was now going to cost them millions in fines, lost production, and legal fees. But the real satisfaction came when I received a call from David Chen, my former supervisor, that afternoon. His voice was strained and worried as he explained that the entire management team was in crisis mode, trying to understand how federal investigators had obtained such detailed documentation of their internal operations. Elena, he said quietly, they're asking questions about you. Miranda thinks you might have stolen proprietary information when you left the company. They're talking about filing criminal charges against you for corporate espionage. The accusation was so absurd that I almost laughed. Everything I had provided to the federal agencies was information I had collected as part of my legitimate job responsibilities. I had documented safety violations and environmental hazards using company equipment during company time as the designated compliance officer. If anyone had committed a crime, it was the executives who had ignored those violations and endangered their workers. David, I said calmly, tell Miranda that if she wants to accuse me of corporate espionage for doing my job, she's welcome to explain that to the FBI agents who will be interviewing her next week about the criminal investigation. The following Monday morning, I received a call that made everything real in a way that even the federal investigations hadn't. It was from Jennifer Walsh, a partner at Morrison Klein & Associates, one of the most prestigious environmental law firms in the country. She had been contacted by the EPA to serve as counsel for their investigation. and she wanted to discuss the possibility of filing a civil lawsuit against Hartwell Industries on behalf of the affected workers. "Miss Vasquez," she said, "your documentation of these violations is extraordinary. You've essentially built the entire case for us. We're prepared to file a class action lawsuit representing all current and former Hartwell employees who were exposed to hazardous chemicals due to the company's negligence." Jennifer explained that civil lawsuits in cases like this typically resulted in settlements ranging from $10 to $50 million, depending on the severity of the violations and the number of affected workers. In this case, with clear evidence of willful negligence and deliberate endangerment, she believed the settlement could be even higher. "There's also the matter of your own claim," she continued. "You were retaliated against for reporting safety violations, which is a clear violation of federal whistleblower protection laws. You have grounds for a significant personal settlement, potentially in the seven-figure range." The idea that I might receive a seven-figure settlement for the harassment I had endured was almost incomprehensible. 3 months ago, I had been earning $42,000 a year and worrying about paying my rent. Now I was potentially looking at a settlement that would set me up for life, all because Miranda Cross and her colleagues had been too arrogant to listen to my concerns. Over the following weeks, the situation at Hartwell Industries deteriorated rapidly. The OSHA shutdown of Building C had forced the company to halt production of their most profitable product line, costing them approximately $200,000 per day in lost revenue. The EPA investigation had expanded to include a comprehensive audit of all their environmental practices, requiring them to hire expensive consultants and lawyers to manage the federal scrutiny. More damaging than the immediate costs, however, was the impact on their corporate reputation. News of the federal investigation leaked to the industry trade publications, and several major clients began canceling contracts or demanding additional safety assurances that Hartwell couldn't provide. The company's stock price, which had been trading at $34 per share before the investigation, dropped to $18 within a month. The media attention was particularly devastating for the executives who had dismissed my concerns. Environmental reporters began digging into the company's safety record, and they discovered a pattern of ignored violations and silenced whistleblowers that went back several years. Miranda Cross, who had built her career on implementing cost-cutting measures, suddenly found herself portrayed in news articles as the HR director who had prioritized profits over worker safety. I learned about much of this from David Chen, who kept me informed about the chaos unfolding at the company. He told me that Miranda had hired her own personal attorney and was blaming the entire situation on what she called rogue employees who had exceeded their authority by conducting unauthorized safety inspections. She was apparently arguing that my documentation of the violations was invalid because I had not followed proper corporate protocols in reporting them. The irony was breathtaking. The same woman who had told me that they didn't have time for my problems was now claiming that I should have followed more elaborate procedures to bring those problems to their attention. She was essentially arguing that the company shouldn't be held responsible for environmental violations because their employees had been too thorough in documenting them. James Morrison, the facility manager who had suggested that worker health complaints were psychosomatic, was taking a different approach. According to David, Morrison was claiming that he had been unaware of the ventilation system problems and that the decision to disable the equipment had been made by maintenance personnel without his knowledge. He was attempting to position himself as another victim of the company's cost-cutting culture rather than one of its architects. The most satisfying piece of information David shared was about the emergency board meeting that Meridian Capital Group had convened to address the crisis. The private equity firm that owned Hartwell was facing the possibility of losing their entire investment in the company, and they were reportedly furious about the management team's handling of environmental compliance. Several board members were demanding the immediate termination of Miranda Cross and James Morrison, arguing that their negligence had created an existential threat to the business. What the board members didn't understand was that firing the executives wouldn't resolve their legal problems. The federal investigation was focused on corporate practices and policies, not just individual bad actors. Even if they replaced the entire management team, Hartwell Industries would still be facing massive fines, ongoing regulatory oversight, and potentially years of expensive litigation. The psychological impact of watching this unfold was complex and often overwhelming. Part of me felt vindicated that my concerns were finally being taken seriously, and that the people who had dismissed and retaliated against me were facing consequences for their actions. But another part of me felt guilty about the collateral damage that was affecting innocent employees who had nothing to do with the management's poor decisions. David told me that several workers in other departments had been laid off as the company struggled to manage the financial impact of the investigation. The stock price decline had wiped out millions of dollars in employee retirement accounts, and many longtime workers were facing the possibility that their pensions might not be secure if the company was forced into bankruptcy. I tried to remind myself that these consequences were the result of management's choices, not mine. I had tried to address the safety violations through proper channels, and I had been ignored, retaliated against, and ultimately driven out of the company. The executives had created this crisis through their own negligence and arrogance, and they were the ones responsible for the harm it was causing to innocent workers. But the guilt was still there, particularly when I thought about people like Marcus Rodriguez, who had supported my safety concerns and was now facing an uncertain future as the company struggled to survive. Marcus had been a good supervisor who genuinely cared about his workers, and he didn't deserve to suffer because of his superior's poor judgment. The emotional complexity of the situation became even more challenging when I received an unexpected phone call from Miranda Cross herself. It was a Thursday evening, about 6 weeks after the federal investigation had begun, and I was preparing dinner when my phone rang. I almost didn't answer when I saw her name on the caller ID, but curiosity got the better of me. "Elena," she said, her voice lacking the condescending tone that had characterized all of our previous interactions. "I hope you'll hear me out. I know we've had our differences, but I think there might be a way for us to resolve this situation that benefits everyone involved." I listened in amazement as Miranda attempted to negotiate some kind of settlement that would minimize the damage to Hartwell Industries. She suggested that if I was willing to modify my testimony to the federal investigators, emphasizing that the violations were the result of miscommunication rather than willful negligence, the company might be able to avoid criminal charges and reduce the financial penalties they were facing. "I understand that you were frustrated with how your concerns were handled," she continued, "and I take responsibility for not giving them the attention they deserved. But destroying the entire company isn't going to help anyone, especially the hundreds of workers who depend on Hartwell for their livelihoods." The conversation was surreal in its disconnect from reality. Miranda was still trying to manage and manipulate the situation, still operating under the assumption that she could control the narrative and minimize the consequences of her actions. She seemed genuinely unable to understand that her dismissal of my concerns had set in motion a series of investigations that were now beyond anyone's ability to control. "Miranda," I said finally, "you told me that you didn't have time for my problems. Now you're asking me to help you solve problems that are much bigger than anything I ever brought to your attention." The irony is remarkable. She was quiet for a moment before responding. "Elena, I know you're angry, and you have every right to be. But think about what you're doing. You have the power to destroy hundreds of jobs and ruin people's lives. Is that really what you want?" The manipulation was breathtaking. She was attempting to make me responsible for the consequences of her own decisions, trying to guilt me into helping her avoid accountability for the safety violations she had ignored. She was still refusing to acknowledge that the company's problems were the result of management's choices, not my decision to report those problems to federal agencies. "Miranda," I said, "I reported safety violations that were endangering workers' health. Everything that's happening now is the result of the company's decision to ignore those violations rather than fix them. If you had spent $50,000 on ventilation repairs instead of trying to silence me, none of this would be happening." After I hung up, I sat in my kitchen thinking about the conversation and what it revealed about Miranda's mindset. Even now, facing federal criminal charges and the potential destruction of her career, she was still trying to avoid taking responsibility for her actions. She was still operating under the assumption that the problem was my response to their negligence rather than the negligence itself. The conversation also made me realize how completely the power dynamic had shifted. 6 months ago, Miranda Cross had been in a position to threaten my job security and dismiss my concerns with a wave of her hand. Now she was calling me at home, pleading for my help in saving her career and the company she had helped to mismanage. The woman who had told me that they didn't have time for my problems was now desperately hoping that I would make time to help her solve theirs. I called Jennifer Walsh the next morning to inform her about Miranda's attempted negotiation. Jennifer wasn't surprised by the contact, explaining that companies facing federal investigations often try to pressure whistleblowers into changing their testimony or withdrawing their complaints. "They're getting desperate," Jennifer said. "Our sources at the EPA tell us that the criminal investigation is moving forward rapidly, and the Justice Department is considering filing charges against multiple executives. The company's attempts to negotiate with you directly suggest that they understand how serious their situation has become." Jennifer also had updates on the civil lawsuit, which was progressing even faster than she had initially expected. More than 200 current and former Hartwell employees had joined the class action, and the medical evidence of chemical exposure was even stronger than they had anticipated. Several workers had developed serious respiratory problems that appeared to be directly related to their exposure to the chemicals in Building C. "The company's insurance carrier is already talking about settlement," Jennifer explained. "They don't want to risk a trial where a jury would hear testimony about executives who ignored safety violations and retaliated against employees who tried to protect workers' health. We're looking at a settlement in the range of $30 to $40 million. The numbers were staggering. The company that had refused to spend $50,000 on safety repairs was now facing $40 million in civil settlements plus additional millions in federal fines and legal fees. Miranda Cross's decision to dismiss my concerns was proving to be one of the most expensive mistakes in corporate history. But the most satisfying development came the following week when David Chen called to tell me that Miranda Cross and James Morrison had been terminated by the board of directors. The announcement had been made at a tense employee meeting where the new interim CEO had apologized for the management team's failures and promised to implement comprehensive safety reforms. "Miranda cleaned out her office yesterday," David told me. "Security escorted her out of the building. She's apparently retained a criminal defense attorney because the federal prosecutors are considering filing personal charges against her." The image of Miranda Cross being escorted out of the building by security guards was almost too perfect to be real. The woman who had dismissed my concerns as unworthy of the company's time was now facing the possibility of federal criminal charges for her role in creating and maintaining unsafe working conditions. The executive who had told me that I needed to adjust my attitude was now adjusting to the reality of unemployment and potential imprisonment. James Morrison's departure was equally satisfying, particularly because it vindicated Marcus Rodriguez's decision to support my safety concerns. Morrison had tried to throw Marcus under the bus by claiming that the ventilation problems were the result of unauthorized maintenance decisions, but the federal investigation had revealed that Morrison himself had signed the work orders that disabled the safety equipment. The investigation had also uncovered email communications between Morrison and other executives discussing the cost savings that would result from operating the facility without proper ventilation. In one particularly damning message, Morrison had written that a few worker complaints about air quality were an acceptable trade-off for the money they would save on maintenance and energy costs. These revelations had made Morrison's position untenable, and the board had terminated him along with Miranda Cross. Both executives were now facing not only unemployment but also the possibility of federal criminal charges that could result in significant prison sentences. As I reflected on these developments, I was struck by how completely the situation had reversed itself. 6 months ago, I had been a struggling employee whose job security depended on the whims of executives who viewed me as dispensable. Now those same executives were unemployed and facing potential criminal prosecution, while I was working with federal investigators and preparing to receive a settlement that would provide financial security for the rest of my life. The transformation wasn't just financial, however. The experience of standing up to corporate negligence and being vindicated by federal investigations had changed my understanding of my own capabilities and worth. I had learned that my expertise and integrity were valuable assets that couldn't be dismissed or ignored indefinitely. I had discovered that sometimes the most powerful response to being told that your problems don't matter is to make them into problems that no one can ignore. The woman who had been intimidated by Miranda Cross's condescending lectures was gone, replaced by someone who understood that technical expertise, moral courage, and meticulous documentation could be more powerful than corporate hierarchies and executive authority. I had learned that the people who dismiss your concerns as unimportant often do so because they lack the knowledge or integrity to address them properly. Most importantly, I had learned that there are times when working within a broken system is not enough, when the only way to protect innocent people is to expose the system's failures to outside authorities who have the power to enforce accountability. Sometimes the most professional thing you can do is to stop being professional and start being honest about what you've witnessed and documented. The federal investigation was still ongoing, and there would be months of additional testimony, depositions, and legal proceedings before the matter was fully resolved. But the major outcomes were already clear. Hartwell Industries would never be the same company that had dismissed my concerns and retaliated against my attempts to protect worker safety. The executives who had told me they didn't have time for my problems had discovered that ignoring those problems was the most time-consuming and expensive decision they could have made. The courthouse steps were slick with morning rain as I walked toward the federal building, clutching the leather portfolio that contained the final pieces of testimony I would provide in the criminal case against Hartwell Industries. It had been 8 months since I first contacted the EPA, and today marked the culmination of the federal investigation that had transformed both my life and the company that had once dismissed my concerns as trivial inconveniences. Special Agent Rebecca Martinez met me in the lobby, her expression serious but satisfied as she guided me through the security checkpoint. Over the past months, she had become more than just the lead investigator on the case. She had become something of a mentor, helping me understand the complex legal processes that my documentation had set in motion. "Elena," she said, as we rode the elevator to the federal prosecutor's office, "I want you to know that this case has become a landmark in environmental criminal enforcement. Your evidence has been instrumental in securing indictments against 5 corporate executives, and the Justice Department is using this case as a model for future prosecutions of corporate environmental crimes." The indictments had been handed down 3 weeks earlier, sending shockwaves through the industrial chemical industry. Miranda Cross faced charges of conspiracy to violate environmental protection laws, obstruction of justice, and endangering workers through willful negligence. James Morrison was charged with similar crimes, along with additional counts related to the falsification of safety records and the deliberate concealment of environmental violations. But the most significant indictment was against Richard Thornton, the CEO of Hartwell Industries, who had been charged under a federal statute that held corporate officers personally responsible for environmental crimes committed by their companies. Thornton faced potential prison sentences of up to 15 years if convicted on all counts, along with personal fines that could exceed $10 million. The other executives facing charges included the chief financial officer, who had approved the budget cuts that led to the disabled ventilation system, and the vice president of operations, who had signed off on the policy of ignoring environmental compliance issues to reduce operating costs. Each of them was looking at substantial prison time and financial penalties that would likely bankrupt them personally. As we entered the prosecutor's conference room, I was struck by the irony of the situation. 8 months ago, these executives had treated me as a disposable employee whose concerns weren't worth their time. Now the federal government was investing millions of dollars in prosecuting them for crimes that were documented primarily through my meticulous record-keeping and professional expertise. Assistant U.S. Attorney Sarah Chen, a woman in her early 40s with the sharp, focused demeanor of a prosecutor who specialized in complex white-collar crimes, greeted me with the respect that had been notably absent from my interactions with Hartwell's management team. She had spent weeks preparing for this case, studying every document I had provided and interviewing dozens of witnesses to build an airtight prosecution. "Miss Vasquez," she said, shaking my hand firmly, "your testimony today will be the final piece of evidence we need to present to the grand jury. The defendant's attorneys have been arguing that their clients were unaware of the environmental violations, but your documentation proves that they not only knew about the problems but actively chose to ignore them." The grand jury proceedings were closed to the public, but Sarah explained that my testimony would focus on the timeline of events leading up to my dismissal from the company. I would be asked to describe in detail how I had identified and reported the safety violations, how management had responded to my concerns, and how they had retaliated against me for raising issues that they considered inconvenient. The defense attorneys are going to argue that you were a disgruntled employee who exaggerated safety concerns to get revenge against supervisors who had criticized your performance, Sarah warned me. We need you to remain calm and factual in your responses, letting the documentation speak for itself rather than appearing emotional or vindictive. The preparation was thorough and professional, reflecting the seriousness with which the federal government was treating the case. Sarah and her team had studied my background extensively, reviewing my educational credentials, my work history, and my professional certifications to establish my credibility as an expert witness. They had also interviewed my former colleagues to corroborate my account of events and to demonstrate that my concerns about safety violations had been legitimate and well-founded. What impressed me most about the federal investigation was the thoroughness with which they had documented the corporate culture that had led to the environmental crimes. They had obtained internal emails, recorded phone conversations, and financial records that painted a detailed picture of a company that had systematically prioritized profits over safety and environmental compliance. One particularly damaging piece of evidence was a recording of a board meeting where Richard Thornton had explicitly instructed his management team to reduce environmental compliance costs by managing employee concerns rather than addressing them. In the recording, Thornton could be heard saying that overzealous employees who raised safety issues were obstacles to profitability that needed to be neutralized through appropriate HR interventions. The language was corporate and euphemistic, but the intent was clear. Thornton had been directing his executives to silence employees who reported environmental violations rather than fix the problems those employees had identified. Miranda Cross's treatment of my concerns hadn't been the result of personal animosity or poor judgment. It had been the implementation of a deliberate corporate policy designed to suppress inconvenient information about safety and environmental violations. Another devastating piece of evidence was a series of emails between James Morrison and the maintenance contractors who had disabled the Building C ventilation system. The emails showed that Morrison had specifically requested the removal of unnecessary safety equipment to reduce energy costs, and that he had instructed the contractors to store the removed components rather than dispose of them so that the equipment could be temporarily reinstalled if inspectors visited the facility. This evidence proved that the disabling of the ventilation system hadn't been the result of equipment failure or maintenance oversight, as the company had initially claimed. It had been a deliberate decision to create unsafe working conditions in order to save money on operating costs, with a plan to conceal the safety violations from regulatory authorities. The financial documents obtained by the federal investigators were equally damaging. They showed that the company had calculated the potential cost of environmental fines and had determined that it was cheaper to risk violations than to maintain proper safety equipment. Internal budget documents included line items for regulatory risk management that were essentially slush funds designed to pay fines if the company was caught violating environmental laws. Most shocking of all was a consulting report commissioned by Hartwell's board of directors that had explicitly recommended reducing environmental compliance costs through what they called strategic non-compliance. The report suggested that the company could save millions of dollars annually by operating below full safety standards and budgeting for occasional fines as a cost of doing business. This document proved that the environmental violations I had discovered weren't the result of incompetence or oversight, but rather the implementation of a deliberate business strategy designed to maximize profits by externalizing the costs of environmental protection onto workers and the surrounding community. The executives weren't guilty of negligence, they were guilty of criminal conspiracy to violate federal environmental laws. When I finally appeared before the grand jury, the experience was both intimidating and empowering. The 23 citizens who would decide whether to indict the Hartwell executives listened intently as I described my efforts to report safety violations and the company's systematic efforts to silence and punish me for doing my job. The grand jurors asked thoughtful questions that demonstrated their understanding of the technical issues involved and their concern about the welfare of the workers who had been exposed to dangerous chemicals. Several jurors seemed particularly disturbed by the evidence that executives had known about health risks and had chosen to maintain unsafe conditions rather than spend money on proper safety equipment. One juror asked me directly whether I believed the executives had understood that their actions were putting workers' health at risk. I answered honestly that the documentation clearly showed they had been aware of the health hazards and had made a conscious decision to prioritize cost savings over worker safety. Another juror asked whether I thought the executives would have acted differently if they had been required to work in the unsafe conditions they had created for their employees. The question struck me as particularly insightful, highlighting the moral bankruptcy of a management philosophy that treated worker safety as an acceptable business expense rather than a fundamental responsibility. The grand jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning indictments against all 5 executives on all counts. The speed of their decision reflected the overwhelming nature of the evidence and the clarity of the criminal conduct that had been documented through my complaints and the subsequent federal investigation. When Sarah Chen called to inform me of the indictments, I felt a complex mixture of satisfaction and sadness. Satisfaction that the executives who had dismissed my concerns and endangered workers' health were finally being held accountable for their actions. Sadness that it had taken federal criminal charges to achieve the basic workplace safety that should have been provided voluntarily by responsible management. The indictments were front-page news in the local newspapers and trade publications, generating extensive coverage of corporate environmental crimes and whistleblower protection laws. Environmental advocacy groups held press conferences praising the federal prosecutors for taking aggressive action against corporate polluters, while business organizations expressed concern about what they characterized as government overreach in regulating private industry. What struck me most about the media coverage was how completely the narrative had changed from the one that Miranda Cross and her colleagues had tried to create. Instead of being portrayed as a disgruntled employee who had exaggerated safety concerns, I was being described as a dedicated professional who had risked her career to protect workers' health and environmental safety. Environmental law experts interviewed by reporters praised the thoroughness of my documentation and the courage I had shown in pursuing my concerns through federal channels when internal corporate processes had failed. Several experts noted that the case would likely encourage other employees to report environmental violations, knowing that federal authorities would take their concerns seriously and protect them from retaliation. The business community's response was more complex and revealing. Some industry leaders criticized the federal prosecutors for pursuing criminal charges in what they characterized as regulatory matters that should have been handled through civil enforcement actions. They argued that criminalizing corporate environmental violations would discourage business investment and economic growth. Other business leaders, however, supported the prosecutions and argued that companies that deliberately violated environmental laws were giving responsible businesses an unfair competitive advantage. They noted that companies that invested in proper safety equipment and environmental compliance were being undercut by competitors who cut costs by ignoring safety regulations and externalizing environmental damage onto workers and communities. The most satisfying aspect of the media coverage was the detailed reporting on the personal consequences facing the indicted executives. Miranda Cross, who had once seemed so confident in her ability to dismiss and intimidate employees, was now facing potential prison time and financial ruin. News reports described her as virtually unemployable in the corporate world due to her criminal charges and the extensive negative publicity surrounding her role in the environmental violations. James Morrison's situation was even more dire. In addition to the federal criminal charges, he was facing multiple civil lawsuits from workers who had developed health problems as a result of chemical exposure in Building C. His personal assets had been frozen pending the resolution of the criminal case, and his wife had reportedly filed for divorce citing the financial and reputational damage caused by his criminal conduct. Richard Thornton, the CEO who had implemented the policy of ignoring environmental compliance issues, was facing the most severe consequences. In addition to the federal criminal charges, the Securities and Exchange Commission had filed civil charges alleging that he had misled investors about the company's environmental compliance costs and regulatory risks. The SEC was seeking to recover tens of millions of dollars in compensation and to ban him permanently from serving as an officer or director of any publicly traded company. The financial impact on Hartwell Industries itself was devastating and far-reaching. The company's stock price had fallen from $34 per share to less than $3, wiping out more than $1 billion in shareholder value. Several major customers had terminated their contracts, citing concerns about the company's environmental practices and legal troubles. The regulatory consequences were equally severe. The EPA had placed the company under enhanced oversight, requiring them to submit detailed environmental compliance reports on a monthly basis and to allow unannounced inspections of all their facilities. OSHA had imposed similar requirements, along with mandating extensive safety training for all employees and comprehensive upgrades to safety equipment throughout the company's operations. The cost of complying with these regulatory requirements was enormous, requiring the company to spend more than $50 million on safety improvements and environmental remediation. The irony was stark. The company that had refused to spend $50,000 on ventilation repairs was now being forced to spend 1,000 times that amount on comprehensive safety upgrades. But the most significant long-term consequence was the impact on the company's corporate culture and business model. Meridian Capital Group, the private equity firm that owned Hartwell, had brought in a completely new management team with explicit instructions to prioritize environmental compliance and worker safety over short-term cost savings. The new CEO, Maria Santos, was an environmental engineer with extensive experience in regulatory compliance and corporate responsibility. Her first actions included implementing comprehensive safety training programs, establishing an anonymous hotline for reporting environmental concerns, and creating financial incentives for managers who exceeded safety and environmental performance targets. Santos also announced that the company would be investing heavily in clean technology and sustainable manufacturing processes, positioning Hartwell as a leader in environmental responsibility, rather than a company that viewed environmental protection as an obstacle to profitability. The transformation was complete and irreversible. The company that had once dismissed environmental concerns as trivial inconveniences was now defining itself through its commitment to environmental excellence. The civil lawsuit that Jennifer Walsh had filed on behalf of the affected workers was resolved through a settlement agreement that provided $42 million in compensation to current and former employees who had been exposed to dangerous chemicals due to the company's negligence. The settlement also included provisions for ongoing medical monitoring and treatment for workers who developed health problems related to their chemical exposure. My personal settlement under the whistleblower protection laws was finalized at the same time, providing me with financial compensation that exceeded anything I had ever imagined when I first reported the safety violations. But more important than the financial compensation was the formal acknowledgement that my concerns had been legitimate and that my treatment by the company had been illegal and unethical. The settlement agreement included a provision requiring Hartwell Industries to implement comprehensive whistleblower protection policies and to provide annual training to all managers on their legal obligations to investigate and address employee safety concerns. The company was also required to establish an independent environmental compliance board with the authority to override management decisions that could compromise safety or environmental protection. As I reflected on the resolution of the case, I was struck by how completely the power dynamics had shifted from those early meetings with Miranda Cross. The woman who had told me that they didn't have time for my problems had ultimately lost her career, her reputation, and potentially her freedom because she had failed to make time for problems that were far more serious than anything I had originally brought to her attention. The executives who had viewed me as a disposable employee whose concerns could be dismissed with impunity had learned that environmental expertise and professional integrity were more powerful than corporate hierarchies and financial resources. They had discovered that treating employees as obstacles to profitability, rather than sources of valuable information, was not just morally wrong but also criminally stupid. Most importantly, they had learned that there are consequences for leaders who prioritize short-term cost savings over the health and safety of their workers and the protection of the environment. The federal criminal justice system had demonstrated that corporate executives could not hide behind corporate structures and legal technicalities when their decisions resulted in deliberate harm to workers and communities. The transformation in my own life was equally profound and far-reaching. The financial security provided by the settlement had allowed me to pursue opportunities that would have been impossible when I was struggling to pay rent on a teacher's salary. I had enrolled in a graduate program in environmental law, with the goal of becoming an advocate for workers and communities affected by corporate environmental crimes. I had also established a nonprofit organization dedicated to supporting employees who were considering reporting environmental violations or safety concerns. The organization provided legal resources, financial assistance, and emotional support to workers who were facing retaliation for trying to protect public health and environmental safety. The work was deeply satisfying in ways that my previous job had never been. Instead of being isolated and dismissed when I raised safety concerns, I was now part of a community of environmental advocates who understood the importance of holding corporations accountable for their environmental impacts. I was working with attorneys, scientists, and policy experts who shared my commitment to protecting workers and communities from corporate negligence. The nonprofit work also allowed me to help other employees who were facing situations similar to what I had experienced at Hartwell. I received calls and emails from workers across the country who had discovered environmental violations at their companies and were unsure how to proceed. Many of them were afraid of losing their jobs or facing retaliation if they reported their concerns to regulatory authorities. I was able to share my experience and provide practical guidance on how to document violations, how to contact federal agencies, and how to protect themselves from retaliation under whistleblower protection laws. Most importantly, I was able to reassure them that their concerns were valuable and important, regardless of how their employers might characterize them. One particularly memorable case involved a woman named Carol Martinez, who worked at a pharmaceutical manufacturing facility where she had discovered that the company was improperly disposing of chemical waste in violation of federal regulations. When she reported her concerns to management, she was told that the disposal methods were industry standard and that she was being overly cautious about regulatory requirements. The language was remarkably similar to what I had heard from Miranda Cross, and I was able to help Carol understand that her concerns were being dismissed not because they were invalid, but because addressing them would require the company to spend money on proper waste disposal methods. I connected her with environmental attorneys and federal investigators, and her case ultimately resulted in significant fines and regulatory reforms at her company. Working with employees like Carol reinforced my understanding that corporate dismissal of environmental concerns follows predictable patterns. Companies that view environmental compliance as an obstacle to profitability will consistently characterize employees who raise safety concerns as problematic, overly cautious, or disloyal. They will attempt to isolate and intimidate those employees rather than address the underlying safety issues. But I had learned that employees who document violations thoroughly and pursue their concerns through appropriate federal channels can ultimately prevail against even the most powerful corporate interests. The key is understanding that environmental protection and worker safety are matters of federal law, not corporate policy, and that federal agencies have both the authority and the responsibility to enforce those laws regardless of corporate objections. The criminal trial of the Hartwell executives began 18 months after my initial complaints to federal agencies. I testified for 3 days, describing in detail my efforts to report safety violations and the company's systematic efforts to silence me. The defense attorneys attempted to portray me as a disgruntled employee who had exaggerated safety concerns, but the documentary evidence I had collected made their arguments untenable. The jury deliberated for 2 days before returning guilty verdicts on all counts against all 5 defendants. Miranda Cross was sentenced to 4 years in federal prison and ordered to pay $2 million in fines and restitution. James Morrison received a similar sentence, along with additional penalties related to his role in falsifying safety records. Richard Thornton, as the CEO who had implemented the policy of ignoring environmental compliance, received the harshest sentence, 8 years in federal prison and personal fines exceeding $15 million. The judge noted in his sentencing remarks that corporate executives who deliberately endanger workers and the environment deserve the most severe penalties available under federal law. The other executives received sentences ranging from 2 to 6 years, along with substantial financial penalties that would likely bankrupt them personally. The message was clear: corporate environmental crimes carry serious consequences, and executives who prioritize profits over safety and environmental protection will be held personally accountable for their decisions. The sentencing hearing was the final chapter in a case that had transformed both my understanding of corporate accountability and my own sense of professional purpose. The executives who had once dismissed my concerns as unworthy of their time were now serving federal prison sentences for crimes that were documented primarily through my professional expertise and moral courage. As I left the courthouse after the sentencing, I reflected on the journey that had brought me from a struggling compliance officer to a key witness in a landmark environmental criminal case. The transformation hadn't been easy or comfortable, but it had taught me valuable lessons about the power of documentation, the importance of persistence, and the ultimate triumph of truth over corporate spin. Most importantly, I had learned that there are times when the most professional thing you can do is to stop trying to work within a broken system and start working to expose that system's failures to authorities who have the power to enforce accountability. Sometimes the only way to solve problems that management considers unworthy of their time is to make those problems into legal obligations that they cannot ignore. The woman who had once been intimidated by Miranda Cross's condescending lectures was gone, replaced by someone who understood that technical expertise, moral integrity, and meticulous documentation were more powerful than corporate hierarchies and executive authority. I had learned that employees who document violations thoroughly and pursue their concerns through appropriate channels can ultimately prevail against even the most arrogant and dismissive corporate leadership. The executives at Hartwell Industries had told me that they didn't have time for my problems, but their dismissal of those problems had ultimately cost them their careers, their freedom, and their financial security. They had learned too late that ignoring legitimate safety concerns is not a cost-saving measure but rather the most expensive mistake a company can make. The case had become a landmark in environmental criminal enforcement, demonstrating that federal prosecutors would pursue aggressive criminal charges against corporate executives who deliberately violated environmental laws. It had also established important precedents for whistleblower protection, showing that employees who reported environmental violations would be protected from retaliation and compensated for any harm they suffered as a result of their courage. As I walked away from the courthouse for the final time, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction and closure. The people who had dismissed my concerns and tried to silence my voice had been held accountable for their actions. The workers who had been endangered by corporate negligence had been compensated for their injuries, and the environmental laws that had been violated with impunity had been enforced with the full power of the federal criminal justice system. The transformation was complete. The problems that Miranda Cross had considered unworthy of the company's time had become problems that no one could ignore. The concerns that had been dismissed as trivial inconveniences had become the foundation for criminal prosecutions that would send corporate executives to federal prison. And the employee who had been treated as disposable had become the catalyst for changes that would protect workers and communities for generations to come. Justice had been served, accountability had been enforced, and the message had been sent clearly to corporate America. Employees who raise legitimate safety concerns deserve respect and protection, not dismissal and retaliation. Companies that choose to ignore environmental laws and endanger their workers will face consequences that far exceed any short-term cost savings they might achieve through negligence and corner cutting. The woman who had once struggled to pay rent on a compliance officer's salary was now financially secure and professionally fulfilled, working to protect other employees from the corporate negligence and retaliation that had once threatened to destroy her own career. The executives who had once seemed so powerful and untouchable were now serving federal prison sentences, their careers and reputations destroyed by their own arrogance and criminal conduct. The circle was complete, the justice was perfect, and the lesson was clear. There are always consequences for those who abuse their power and dismiss the legitimate concerns of dedicated employees. Sometimes those consequences take time to manifest, but when they arrive, they are thorough, decisive, and permanent. 5 years had passed since the Hartwell Industries criminal convictions made national headlines, and I found myself standing in the gleaming conference room of Vasquez Environmental Advocacy, the nonprofit organization that had grown far beyond anything I had originally envisioned. The mahogany table was surrounded by environmental attorneys, federal investigators, corporate whistleblowers, and policy experts who had gathered for our quarterly strategy meeting to discuss ongoing cases and legislative initiatives. The transformation of my life had been so complete that sometimes I had to remind myself of the frightened compliance officer who had once sat in Miranda Cross's office, listening to lectures about being a team player and not rocking the boat. That woman felt like a character from someone else's story, a person I had known but could barely recognize in my current role as one of the country's most prominent advocates for environmental whistleblower protection. The organization now employed 15 full-time staff members, including attorneys who specialized in environmental law, investigators who helped document corporate violations, and counselors who provided emotional support to employees facing retaliation for reporting safety concerns. We had successfully supported more than 300 whistleblower cases, resulting in over $2 billion in corporate fines and settlements, and had helped draft federal legislation that strengthened protections for employees who reported environmental violations. Dr. Amanda Richardson, our lead environmental scientist, was presenting the latest developments in a case that had consumed much of our attention for the past year. A petroleum refinery in Louisiana had been systematically falsifying air quality reports while exposing workers and surrounding communities to dangerous levels of toxic chemicals. The case had many similarities to my experience at Hartwell, but the scale of the violations and the potential health impacts were far more severe. The documentation provided by the whistleblower is extraordinary, Amanda explained, displaying charts and graphs that showed clear patterns of regulatory violations and cover-ups. We're looking at potential criminal charges against at least 8 corporate executives, and the EPA is considering fines that could exceed $100 million. The whistleblower in this case was Maria Santos, not to be confused with the CEO who had replaced Richard Thornton at Hartwell Industries. This Maria was a chemical engineer who had discovered that her company was using outdated monitoring equipment that consistently underreported emission levels, allowing them to violate air quality standards, while appearing to be in compliance with federal regulations. When Maria had brought her concerns to management, she had been told that upgrading the monitoring equipment would be too expensive and that the current system was adequate for regulatory purposes. When she persisted in raising safety concerns, she had been transferred to a different department and ultimately demoted to a position that didn't require security clearance, effectively ending her access to the information she needed to document the violations. The retaliation Maria faced was textbook corporate intimidation, designed to isolate her from the information and resources she needed to pursue her concerns, while making it clear to other employees that challenging management decisions would result in career consequences. It was the same playbook that Miranda Cross and her colleagues had used against me, refined and systematized to maximize its effectiveness in silencing inconvenient voices. But Maria had learned from cases like mine, and she had contacted our organization before the retaliation became severe enough to threaten her employment. We had helped her document the violations thoroughly, connected her with federal investigators, and provided legal protection that prevented the company from terminating her employment or escalating their intimidation tactics. The difference in outcomes was dramatic. Where I had been forced to endure months of harassment and ultimately lost my job before achieving justice, Maria was able to maintain her employment while federal agencies investigated her concerns and built criminal cases against the executives who had ignored her reports. The protections we had helped establish through legislation and litigation were working exactly as intended. Thomas Chen, our chief legal counsel and coincidentally the son of my former supervisor David Chen, provided updates on the legislative initiatives we were supporting in Congress. The Chen family had been deeply affected by the Hartwell case, not just because of David's professional relationship with me, but because Thomas had been inspired by the environmental advocacy work to pursue a career in environmental law. The Environmental Whistleblower Protection Enhancement Act is moving through committee review, Thomas reported. If passed, it would provide even stronger protections for employees who report environmental violations, including enhanced financial compensation for retaliation victims and criminal penalties for executives who engage in intimidation tactics. The legislation had been drafted based on lessons learned from hundreds of whistleblower cases, including detailed analysis of the tactics companies used to silence employees and the gaps in existing legal protections that allowed retaliation to continue. It represented the culmination of years of advocacy work, and would provide the kind of comprehensive protection that could have prevented much of the suffering I had endured during my conflict with Hartwell Industries. One of the most satisfying aspects of the legislative work was the testimony I had provided to congressional committees about the need for stronger whistleblower protections. Standing in the ornate hearing rooms of the Capitol, addressing senators and representatives who had the power to change federal law, I often thought about Miranda Cross's dismissive comment that they didn't have time for my problems. The irony was perfect. The concerns that had been considered unworthy of a corporate HR director's attention were now being discussed by some of the most powerful people in the country, and the documentation I had created as a struggling compliance officer was being used to draft federal legislation that would protect millions of workers across the United States. During one particularly memorable hearing, I had been asked by Senator Patricia Williams, the chair of the Environment and Public Works Committee, whether I believed stronger legal protections would encourage more employees to report environmental violations. My response had been based on 5 years of experience working with hundreds of potential whistleblowers. Senator Williams, I had said, the decision to report environmental violations is never easy for employees, regardless of the legal protections available. These are people who have families to support, mortgages to pay, and careers to protect. They understand that challenging powerful corporate interests involves significant personal risks. I had paused, thinking about all the conversations I had had with employees who were torn between their professional obligations and their fear of retaliation. But what stronger legal protections do provide is the assurance that employees who choose to do the right thing will not be destroyed financially or professionally for their courage. They provide a safety net that makes it possible for people to prioritize public safety over personal security. The senator had nodded thoughtfully before asking a follow-up question that went to the heart of corporate accountability. Vasquez, in your experience, do you believe that corporate executives understand the legal risks they face when they retaliate against employees who report environmental violations? The question had given me an opportunity to share one of the most important insights I had gained from years of whistleblower advocacy work. Senator, in many cases I believe corporate executives understand the legal risks but have calculated that the probability of being prosecuted is low enough that retaliation is worth the risk. They view potential legal penalties as a cost of doing business rather than a meaningful deterrent. I had continued, drawing on specific examples from our case files. What changes that calculation is consistent enforcement of existing laws and meaningful penalties that make retaliation more expensive than compliance. When executives see their peers facing prison sentences and personal bankruptcy for environmental crimes, they become much more careful about how they respond to employee safety concerns. The legislative testimony had been covered extensively in environmental trade publications and had contributed to growing bipartisan support for stronger whistleblower protections. The coverage had also brought additional attention to our organization and had resulted in increased funding from foundations and individual donors who supported our mission. The financial growth of the organization had allowed us to expand our services significantly beyond what I had originally envisioned. In addition to supporting individual whistleblower cases, we now conducted training programs for employees in high-risk industries, educating them about their rights and responsibilities when they discovered environmental violations. We also worked with labor unions to develop environmental safety programs that helped workers identify and report violations before they resulted in serious health consequences or environmental damage. The union partnerships had been particularly effective because they provided collective protection for workers who might otherwise be afraid to challenge management decisions individually. One of our most successful programs involved partnerships with community colleges and technical schools to provide environmental compliance training for workers in industries with high rates of violations. The training covered both the technical aspects of environmental monitoring and the legal protections available to employees who discovered problems. The community college programs had proven to be an effective way to reach workers before they encountered situations like the one I had faced at Hartwell Industries. By understanding their rights and responsibilities in advance, these workers were better prepared to document violations properly and to seek appropriate legal protection when they faced retaliation. Dr. Sarah Martinez, our Director of Community Outreach, had developed innovative training materials that made complex environmental regulations accessible to workers with varying levels of education and technical background. The materials used real-world examples from our case files, including detailed analysis of the Hartwell Industries case, to illustrate both the importance of environmental compliance and the protections available to employees who reported violations. The feedback from our training participants has been overwhelmingly positive, Sarah reported during our quarterly meeting. Workers consistently tell us that the training gives them confidence to speak up about safety concerns and helps them understand that environmental protection is part of their professional responsibility, not an optional extra that they can ignore when it's inconvenient. The training programs had also had an unexpected benefit for the companies whose workers participated. Several corporate executives had contacted us to report that employees who had completed our training were identifying and reporting violations internally before they became serious enough to attract federal attention. The training was actually helping companies avoid the kind of catastrophic legal problems that had destroyed Hartwell Industries. This development had led to a new initiative where we worked directly with companies to develop comprehensive environmental compliance programs that encouraged employee reporting while providing protection from retaliation. The corporate consulting work was controversial within our organization, with some staff members arguing that we shouldn't be helping the same types of companies that had traditionally silenced environmental whistleblowers. But I believe that the consulting work represented an evolution in our mission rather than a betrayal of our principles. If we could help companies create cultures where environmental concerns were addressed promptly and professionally, we could prevent the kind of systematic violations and retaliation that had made my experience at Hartwell Industries necessary. The key was ensuring that the corporate programs we helped develop included genuine protections for employees and meaningful accountability for executives who failed to address reported violations. We insisted on independent oversight mechanisms and regular audits to verify that companies were actually implementing the policies they had committed to follow. One of our most successful corporate partnerships was with Meridian Industries, the company that had been formed when Meridian Capital Group restructured Hartwell Industries after the criminal convictions. The new company had hired Maria Santos, the environmental engineer who had replaced Richard Thornton, to serve as chief environmental officer, and she had contacted us about developing a comprehensive whistleblower protection program. Working with Maria Santos had been surreal in many ways, given that she shared a name with one of our current whistleblower clients and was now running the company where I had once been dismissed and retaliated against for raising environmental concerns. But the collaboration had been remarkably productive, resulting in one of the most comprehensive corporate environmental compliance programs in the industry. The program included mandatory training for all employees on environmental regulations and reporting procedures, an anonymous hotline for reporting concerns, independent investigation of all reported violations, and financial incentives for employees who identified problems before they resulted in regulatory violations. Most importantly, the program included zero-tolerance policies for retaliation, with executives facing immediate termination and potential personal liability if they intimidated or punished employees who reported environmental concerns. The success of the Meridian Industries program had attracted attention from other companies and had led to requests for similar consulting arrangements. We were now working with more than 20 major corporations to develop environmental compliance programs that prioritized transparency and accountability over the kind of cost-cutting and corner-cutting that had characterized Hartwell Industries under its previous management. The corporate consulting work had also provided valuable insights into the organizational cultures that led to environmental violations and employee retaliation. We had learned that companies with strong environmental performance typically had several characteristics in common: senior leadership that genuinely prioritized environmental compliance, middle managers who were trained and incentivized to address safety concerns promptly, and organizational cultures that treated employee reporting as valuable information rather than disloyalty or troublemaking. Conversely, companies with poor environmental records typically had corporate cultures where environmental compliance was viewed as an obstacle to profitability, where middle managers were pressured to minimize compliance costs, and where employees who raised safety concerns were viewed as problems to be managed rather than sources of valuable information. Understanding these organizational patterns had helped us develop more effective strategies for supporting whistleblowers and for advocating policy changes that addressed the root causes of environmental violations. We had learned that individual bad actors like Miranda Cross were often symptoms of broader organizational problems rather than isolated cases of poor judgment or personal animosity. The research insights had also informed our work with federal agencies to develop more effective enforcement strategies. Traditional regulatory approaches focused primarily on identifying and punishing violations after they had occurred, but our work suggested that prevention required addressing the organizational cultures and incentive structures that led to violations in the first place. We had worked with the EPA and OSHA to develop guidance documents for corporations that wanted to establish effective environmental compliance programs. And we had provided training for federal investigators on how to identify patterns of organizational dysfunction that indicated systemic rather than isolated violations. The federal agency partnerships had been particularly rewarding because they allowed us to influence enforcement practices at a national level rather than just supporting individual cases. When federal investigators understood the organizational dynamics that led to environmental violations, they were better able to build cases that addressed root causes rather than just symptoms. Agent Rebecca Martinez, who had led the original Hartwell Industries investigation, had become a frequent collaborator on our federal agency training programs. She often spoke about how the documentation I had provided in the Hartwell case had changed her understanding of corporate environmental crimes and had influenced her approach to subsequent investigations. The Vasquez case taught us that environmental violations are rarely the result of technical failures or oversight. Rebecca explained during one of our training sessions for federal investigators. They're typically the result of deliberate decisions by executives who understand the legal requirements but choose to prioritize cost savings over compliance. She continued, drawing on examples from dozens of cases she had investigated since Hartwell Industries. What that means for investigators is that we need to look for patterns of organizational decision-making rather than just technical violations. We need to understand the corporate culture and incentive structures that led to the violations, not just document the violations themselves. The federal training programs had contributed to a significant increase in environmental criminal prosecutions and had resulted in more comprehensive investigations that addressed organizational culture rather than just individual bad actors. The approach was more time-consuming and resource-intensive than traditional enforcement methods, but it was also more effective at preventing future violations and protecting potential whistleblowers. One of the most satisfying developments in our federal agency work was the establishment of specialized whistleblower protection units within both the EPA and OSHA. These units were staffed by investigators who understood the dynamics of corporate retaliation and were trained to provide comprehensive support to employees who reported environmental violations. The specialized units had significantly reduced the time required to investigate whistleblower complaints and had improved the success rate for employees seeking protection from retaliation. They had also developed more sophisticated methods for documenting retaliation, making it easier to build cases against executives who attempted to intimidate or punish employees who reported violations. The success of the federal whistleblower protection units had inspired state-level initiatives in several states with major industrial facilities. California, Texas, and Louisiana had all established state-level programs modeled on the federal units, providing additional layers of protection for employees who discovered environmental violations at companies that operated primarily within state boundaries. The state-level programs had been particularly important for addressing violations at smaller companies that might not attract federal attention but could still pose significant risks to workers and communities. State investigators often had better knowledge of local industrial operations and could respond more quickly to employee concerns than federal agencies with national responsibilities. Working with state agencies had also provided opportunities to address environmental justice issues that were often overlooked in federal enforcement programs. Many of the worst environmental violations occurred in low-income communities and communities of color, where residents had less political power to demand accountability from polluting companies. Our organization had developed specialized programs to support environmental justice communities, providing legal resources and technical assistance to residents who were dealing with corporate pollution and government agencies that were slow to respond to their concerns. The environmental justice work had added a community organizing component to our mission that complemented our focus on individual whistleblower cases. One particularly impactful environmental justice case involved a chemical plant in a predominantly Hispanic community in Texas, where residents had been complaining for years about air quality problems that government agencies had failed to investigate adequately. We had worked with community organizers to document the health impacts and had connected them with a company employee who had been afraid to report violations for fear of losing his job. The combination of community organizing and insider information had resulted in a comprehensive federal investigation that revealed systematic violations of air quality standards and deliberate concealment of emission data. The case had resulted in significant fines against the company and court-ordered health monitoring for affected residents, but more importantly, it had demonstrated the power of combining whistleblower protection with community advocacy. The environmental justice work had also influenced our approach to corporate consulting, helping us understand that effective environmental compliance programs needed to consider community impacts rather than just worker safety and regulatory compliance. Companies that ignored community concerns were more likely to face organized opposition and regulatory scrutiny, regardless of their formal compliance with environmental laws. As I reflected on the growth and evolution of our organization over the past 5 years, I was struck by how completely my understanding of environmental advocacy had changed since my days as a compliance officer at Hartwell Industries. What had started as a personal struggle against corporate retaliation had evolved into a comprehensive approach to environmental protection that addressed individual cases, organizational culture, regulatory enforcement, legislative reform, and community empowerment. The transformation had been possible because the Hartwell Industries case had provided credibility and resources that allowed us to pursue a much broader agenda than traditional environmental organizations. The criminal convictions had demonstrated that environmental violations could result in serious consequences for corporate executives, providing leverage that we could use in negotiations with other companies and policy discussions with government agencies. The financial settlement had provided the resources necessary to build a professional organization with the expertise and capacity to take on complex cases and policy initiatives. But perhaps most importantly, the public attention generated by the case had created opportunities to educate employees, communities, and policymakers about the importance of environmental whistleblower protection. Looking forward, I could see opportunities to expand our work internationally, as environmental violations and whistleblower retaliation were global problems that required coordinated responses across national boundaries. We had already received inquiries from environmental advocates in several countries who were interested in adapting our training programs and legal strategies to their own regulatory contexts. The international work would require partnerships with organizations that understood local legal systems and cultural contexts, but the core principles of thorough documentation, strategic legal protection, and organizational culture change were applicable across different countries and regulatory frameworks. As our quarterly strategy meeting concluded, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction about the progress we had made and optimism about the opportunities ahead. The problems that Miranda Cross had dismissed as unworthy of her time had become the foundation for an organization that was protecting workers and communities across the country and potentially around the world. The woman who had once been intimidated by corporate executives and uncertain about her own expertise was now leading an organization that those same types of executives took seriously and respected, even when they disagreed with our positions. The transformation had been complete, permanent, and more meaningful than I could have imagined when I first contacted the EPA about Hartwell Industries. Most importantly, the work was preventing other employees from experiencing the isolation, retaliation, and professional destruction that I had endured when I tried to protect workers and communities from corporate negligence. Every successful case, every improved policy, and every protected whistleblower represented progress toward a world where doing the right thing was supported rather than punished. The legacy of Miranda Cross's dismissive arrogance and Richard Thornton's criminal negligence had become a force for environmental protection and worker safety that would continue long after their prison sentences were completed. The problems they had refused to acknowledge had become solutions that were protecting countless people from corporate environmental crimes. The circle was not just complete, it was expanding, creating positive change that reached far beyond the original scope of my concerns about ventilation systems and air quality monitoring. Sometimes the smallest acts of courage and integrity could grow into movements that changed entire industries and protected future generations from the consequences of corporate irresponsibility and executive arrogance. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.